David Foster Wallace was a master at the marijuana style of writing. And what do I mean by that? Well, it has nothing to do with smoking marijuana, but rather a pinpoint OCD focus on basic objects and thoughts. Wallace was a master at this, and he is almost the perfect writer of this style because at one point in his life, he was a marijuana addict and he is a chronic overthinker in general. And today we'll be hearing Wallace talk about this writing style and then examining the famous chapter 2 of Infinite Jest, where the character Ken Erdedy, who is a marijuana addict, is just going absolutely crazy. And if you guys don't already know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to David Foster Wallace. Go check out the playlist down below if you want a ton more videos on Wallace. And let's hop into the quote. Quote, "The stuff that drives us crazy is the really, really basic stuff. What are numbers? What exactly are these three dimensions we are sitting in? Stuff that it's embarrassing to talk about out loud because it sounds like pot smoking. Ooh, ooh, ooh. But in some sense, this is what mathematicians and back in the Greeks philosophers, because there was no difference at the time, this is what they did." And Wallace makes a bunch of great points there, but when you go back to the early botanists like Heraclitus and the early scientists and mathematicians like Aristotle and the other Greek mathematicians, they were having their mind blown by basic stuff. They were just asking these simple questions and getting simple answers and focusing entirely on these mostly basic things that we take for granted today, and we're shocked by their findings. But today, all the magic, all the wonder has been taken out because there is an explanation for everything. Even someone who has little to no knowledge about anything or any curiosity can look something up on YouTube and find an answer to anything that they want. And so how do we escape this trap, walking around in this world not filled with magic, with no wonder? And one of the ways is through complete attention, through an almost Buddhist rendering of awareness that helps us see the world as a child or a beginner again and again. But most people cannot tap into that automatically because to be able to gain that attention and that beginner's or child's mind actually requires a lot of work and transformation, and you have to be consciously doing it. It's not just something that most of the time people start doing, and this is actually what ecstatic awakenings are a lot of the time when you look all throughout history in the West, but you hear a lot more about it in the East. These people have these awakenings out of nowhere, and what they're really getting into is just a movement toward a higher level of awareness. And so if you jump from this level to awareness to this level of awareness, you're going to be inundated not just with sensory overload, but with spiritual overload and all these other things. And it's going to feel great because you're suddenly at this new level. It's like you've been watching this video on 120p and now you're watching it in 1440. But in the West and really all throughout the world, all throughout time, one of the methodologies to gain this awareness instantly was through drugs. And one of the most prolific drugs in the West is marijuana. And marijuana does help you automatically get this renewed childlike intention. And obviously it's short-lived and causes other issues while you're on it. So you don't have that clear, sober state that someone, let's say, who meditated or relaxed their way into that awareness has. But for someone like Wallace, whose mom was a professor of English and dad was a professor of philosophy, he was raised very rationally. And when I look at him genetically, and I can only tell, I'm sure he's been a chronic thinker, sensitive type individual who is kind of a people pleaser his entire life. That's what he was born to be. And so he adapted to his parents' high expectations of him in terms of language and became very aware about language. But language and reality are very different. And so with Wallace's marijuana usage, he gained this deeper awareness of reality that, like most first-time pot smokers, gave him the sense of wonder. He, I'm sure, was stoned and laughing with his friends and doing the, ooh, oh my God, all that type of stuff. But what's important here is that eventually, because pot is actually just a shortcut, it's, as I was saying, it's not actually a permanent reality. A lot of the times people just become complacent with that reality, because if you are walking around soberly and highly aware and almost at that ecstatic state all the time, you are only able to maintain that because you're in that childlike state of wonder and you're observing things and letting them pass through you. But when I think of the typical stoner that I've known in my life, they are mostly unaware and using it as a defense mechanism of, from the trauma that the cultural hypnotic system, imparts on them, the capitalist system and the grind, our lives are hard. And so people are looking for easy ways to numb the pain. And numbing the pain and being aware are on two different sides of the English Channel. But for some people who don't just go totally into numbing, instead of using it to become more aware, a lot of the time people project drug usage, especially marijuana usage, towards some ideal, towards some goal. For instance, music or art, or sometimes even writing. And so Wallace actually, from what I could tell from what people have said about him and his kind of brief talks on using marijuana, was able actually to connect with humans at a deeper level through his own writing. So Wallace at Amherst in college, when he was writing The Broom of the System, realized when he was really stoned that he could have conversations, these deep dialogues between people, and actually be connecting with them and make all these jokes up and have these conversations he'd never be able to have. And so he took that primordial language skill that was drilled into him by his parents and actually doubled down on it. But as you guys probably know, language actually separates us from a reality and from awareness a lot of the time. And so this is probably why Wallace, even though he was already an addictive, type personality, but doubling down with marijuana and language and his writing was actually very dangerous for him because he moved further into the fantastical world where he felt like he was connecting. But the further he got into that hole, the less he was actually connecting. And you see this writing come up obviously in chapter 2 because like, wow, how does this guy know how to write about marijuana addiction so good? Like, this is wonderful. But also in the Don Gately scenes and a lot of the other things where he talks about in detail how drugs and how addiction slowly rids everything in your life away. You think it's giving you these key certain things that are more important than anything else. But then at one point, at the very end of the line, at when you bottom out, you realize it's just you and the drug, and now it's starting to eat you. This became a problem with Wallace after his rehab because he realized, and this is why he relapsed so many times, is that he couldn't write without marijuana. He kind of hit this place where a lot of addicts hit. I'm actually going to make a series on this called Creativity and the Fire, or Creativity and Addiction, where I'm going to just kind of go over a lot of the basics about this, that a lot of creatives are also addicts because they feel like their drug or their codependent relationship with a muse or with whatever else is what makes them a great artist. And it actually is at some level for a while. And to be able to get off of that and to rekindle their relationship with art sober is going to be very hard and might take years. And if you're a professional writer, I've seen a lot of musicians do this. I'm sure you guys have too. There's a musician out there and they're just on drugs or on so many different types of drugs. There's a famous rap group called the Suicide Boys, and one of the two rappers on there who, did all the production was on massive amounts of heroin and was just doing all these drugs. And he was making music that everybody loved and were like, genre bending for shadow rap. But eventually he wanted to get sober. So he went to rehab and he got sober, and he's been sober for 5, 6, 7 years now or whatever. And what was problematic about that, though, is that his style changed. Their sober style is now much different because both of them actually got sober. And so now all the fans are always saying like, oh, we want all this dark rap about drugs, but now they see the world and music differently. And so now, there's always this tension between the before and after art. And it's not like their music fell off. Their music is objectively just as good, if not better, but it's not that same original thing. And so an example of this basic type of writing. So in chapter 2 of Infinite Jest, we have this, I think, 13-page bonanza of Wallace talking about a guy named Ken who is going to receive like $1,200 worth of marijuana. And he's just waiting. He's sitting there waiting. It's probably only lapsing over 30 minutes of time. But in his mind, he's just thinking about all the things he's going to do and like all this. He has all this pressure and anxiety because he's falling back into his marijuana addiction. And just a really simple line that he keeps coming back to is just talking about this insect. And so this character will be going off about what he's going to do with the marijuana and how he's going to watch all these movies and all this stuff. And then suddenly he'll just return to the insect. Quote, the insect on the shelf was back. It didn't seem to do anything. It just came out of the hole in the girder onto the edge of the steel shelf and sat there. After a while, it would disappear back into the hole in the girder, and he was pretty sure it didn't do anything in there. He felt similar to the insect inside the girder his shelf was connected to, but was not sure just how he was similar. Once he decided to own marijuana one more last time, he was committed to several courses of action. Why is this relevant? But that's the point. It's not relevant, but there's this focus on these basic things when you go back to this childlike mentality. And it's actually very important to be able to do this because the most important things for us in terms of our own growth and development are the fundamentals. When we get too lost in the weeds, it's actually a safety net for us because we create our own little kingdoms and our own little prisons out in these far off reach, these far off places. But as Wallace was saying in the earlier quote, the stuff that drives us crazy is the basic stuff. What are numbers? Does math exist outside of reality? If humans weren't here, would math still exist? Why did the human brain size double in 10,000 years or whatever? How did we acquire language? What's our purpose? These are the easy questions. These aren't talking about how do we build a better hypersonic nuclear missile and like going deep into that, or Derrida or Heidegger's influence on Derrida. No, it's the simple stuff, and it's the same for our own life. A lot of the time, we inflate the false self, and to prevent ourselves from going back and probing these questions, and that's what kind of therapy or self-reflection, journaling, meditating does is it kind of goes back to the source and makes you confront those questions. And what it does is make you realize that you actually don't know anything, that you're pretty powerless, and you all these other attachments and these egoic creations that you were doing are just stemming most of the time from that trauma, especially if you're building them in a negative manner. And another thing I'd like to ask, I know a lot of you guys out there, well, probably not a lot of you guys, but if there are any current smokers, former smokers, people who chew the nicotine gum, I've never been into nicotine. I don't really enjoy it. It just gives me headaches. Maybe I never did enough, but I mean, that's a good thing. But I do know though from extensive research on creativity and stuff that nicotine creates synapses in the mind, so it's easier to be creative. Wallace has talked about this at length before. That's for a different video. But do you think does it tap you into this kind of same OCD pinpoint focus, or just kind of the haze of marijuana help you do that easier? How is it different? For anyone who could compare it to a meditative sober state or a marijuana OCD state, where in both of those states you kind of focus on the basic things a little bit more. How does that compare? Is it the same or is it something totally different? I don't know, because Wallace continued using nicotine almost to the end of his life. I think he quit right before he tried to get off of his last antidepressant. But I always question, when I look at like AA and like addicts and stuff, I'm like, when they're still, and I understand why they're still smoking, because doing heroin or cigarettes don't throw you down the same conundrum. You don't go spend all the money from your savings account or beat people up when you're on nicotine. That type of stuff happens when you're an alcoholic or you're a drug addict. And a lot of times addicts, I'm sure, still need something to hold them over. But I always wonder why that still counts. Like if you're smoking a cig every day or a vape or whatever, in my opinion, you're still an addict. You're still tapping into that same dopamine system. But having known addicts, almost all of them who are still smoking or using some form of nicotine, I'm sure it's very helpful to them. But give me some knowledge on that. Thank you guys for being here. And I guess if you want some solutions or some ideas about how to use this in your own writing, obviously that awareness state, certain times in writing or with characters, they actually move into a higher degree of awareness. Maybe something tragic has just happened, or something's been revealed, and when that happens, and you get taken into a new mode of reality, and most of the time you're actually thinking of something. This is what happens at death when someone is dying. Good writing always makes them think about something, have these last thoughts. They become more aware of the most important things, and so in your writing, most of the time, maybe not in a short story all the time, but for sure in novels, there's going to be these heightened degrees of awareness. And it's kind of looking at chapter 2 of Infinite Jest and what Wallace did with Ken is, I think, a good thing, because you can bring some of that in. You don't have to be as aggressive or have the same content, but learning how to do that pinpoint focus would be helpful. And when you're in this state, just I guess for some tips, time slows down. That's why because dopamine and all that has a connection to our perception of time, and that's why people who are stoned or even meditating and all that are like, I've been doing this for 60, like I meditate for 30 to 60 minutes a day, and sometimes I go for 45 minutes and it feels like it was like 20. The timer's going off. I'm like, holy hell, what the hell just happened? And so time slows down. So that's something else you can do. Like it shouldn't feel necessarily rushed. You're not like, oh my God, what's going on? And it's not like you're aware in this new world and you want to see everything. You're focusing on things, and it's kind of this slow pattern of recognition and of consciousness. It's not aggressive. And maybe that's the difference between nicotine and this pinpoint state is nicotine has more aggressive synapses than more slow ones.